Thank you for joining us. My name is Derek Ishikawa, and I am the current president of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of LA County. Thank you very much for joining us. We have a great panel of speakers, and we really appreciate your attention and focus to this important topic. I think there's always a great opportunity to revisit such an important milestone in many Angelino childhoods, including mine. And obviously it's an event that continues to resonate in our broader LA community. I want to take a brief moment and thank the co-sponsors of the event. We have the Asian Pacific American Lawyers of Inland Empire, Asian Pacific American Women Lawyers Alliance, Beverly Hills Bar Association, Black Women Lawyers of Los Angeles, California Asian Pacific American Bar Association, California Lawyers Association Racial Justice Committee, Federal Bar Association, Los Angeles Chapter, the Japanese American Bar Association, the John N. Langston Bar Association, the Korean American Bar Association of Southern California, the Korean Prosecutors Association, the Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance, the Latina Lawyers Bar Association, the LA County Bar Association, the Mexican American Bar Association, the Multicultural Bar Alliance of Southern California, the Philippine American Bar Association, the South Asian Bar Association of Southern California, the Southern California Chinese Lawyers Association, Southwestern Law School Public Interest Law Concentration, the Thai American Bar Association, UCLA School of Law, the UCLA School of Law Critical Race Studies Program, the UCLA School of Law David J. Epstein Program in Public Interest, the USC Gould School of Law, and the Women Lawyers Association of Los Angeles. Obviously, we've been able to collaborate with a great number of our sister bar associations throughout Los Angeles and throughout the state, and we're very grateful to have to be able to share this fantastic program with all of their members and with the broader Los Angeles legal and broader public community. I am going to go ahead and turn this over to my esteemed colleague, Kathy Ta, who's one of the co-chairs of the APABA CLE committee. But before I do so, I just want to thank again the panelists for taking the time to join us on this important discussion, and also for the great committee members who helped put this event together. Kathy, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Derek. I'm excited for tonight's event, but let's cover some housekeeping matters first for everybody. Tonight's program is certified for 1.0 hours of elimination of bias MCLE credit, plus a quarter hour of general participatory MCLE credit. Written materials were included in the event reminder yesterday, but if you need to grab them now, you can easily do so at the APABA website, and I've just dropped the link in the chat function where you can easily find it. Certification will be emailed to all participants within the next 7 days using your login email that you use for tonight's event. Now, turning to tonight's program, the events of the 5 days from April 29th through May 3rd, 1992 have been called various names, including from the LA riots and the LA civil unrest to the LA Uprising and Saúl, which is 429 in Korean, and more. What the events of those 5 days mean to Angelinos and communities spread throughout Los Angeles is as diverse and as the multifold labels attached to what happened. Over the course of the past 30 years, wounds have lingered and at times festered. Communities continue to struggle to understand each other, even while all at the same time forging relationships to work together. This evening's panel is uniquely qualified to speak on the impact of the 1992 LA Uprising on the communities of Los Angeles and beyond, in addition to the challenges that remain for community partnerships. Our moderator tonight is Professor Jerry Kang, Distinguished Professor of Law and Distinguished Professor of Asian American Studies. Until recently, he served as UCLA's founding Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. He's a widely sought after educator on the nexus between implicit bias and the law. Dr. Alexandra is Executive Director of Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance, which was founded in 1992. She has over 20 years experience in social justice work and holds a PhD from Columbia University. Among others, she also serves on the board of the LA County Federation of Labor and the National Immigration Law Center. Professor Jody Armour is Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. He studies the relationship between racial justice, criminal justice, and the rule of law, among other subjects, of course. He is also a Soros Justice Senior Fellow at the Open Society Institute Center on Crime, Communities, and Culture. Last but not least, we've got Professor Saúl Sarabia, who is an academic coordinator and leads the Labor and decarceration initiative for the UCLA Institute for Research on Labor and Employment. As an independent consultant through Solidarity Consulting and a community organizer, he works towards ending structural racism and discrimination of all kinds. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions tonight. Professor Kang will do his best to monitor them and incorporate them as we go along during tonight's discussion. With that, I thank and welcome our panel and all of the participants, and it's all yours, Professor Kang.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you, Derek, for the kind introduction. And I'm really excited for this conversation. And thank you for showing up. I know that people are busy. There are lots of things always going on, but it's going to be an important moment for us to remember and think through really hard questions. Let me start with a little bit of framing. LA Uprising, 1992 until now is the title of this conversation. And as Kathy already highlighted, whether we call it an uprising, riots, rebellion, any of these things, all of these things is actually a choice. And each word conveys a different sensibility about responsibility, about political content, about the reasons for violence. And in some sense, I'm going to ask you to dwell in a certain kind of contradiction. I know my friend Saúl Sarabia often talks about inhabiting a certain kind of contradiction to see the world from multiple perspectives. And I want, at least for the moment, for the conversation, for us to be able to do that so that we can actually see it as all of these things, as none of these things, as words clumsily attached to an extraordinary moment that had a profound impact on many of us individually and certainly us collectively as part of a city. I call it just Haegu, which just means 429, which is the way that Koreans actually remember. In some ways, sui generis events. The claim is this number shall not be used by any other event going forward because we cannot imagine another event of such significance happening on such a day on April 29. And so I call it Haegu. So that's the thing about vocabulary, and even just the title of the event motions or gestures us to the complexities that are sort of embedded in this conversation. I realize that some of you are not even 30, and even if you are, you couldn't remember it as an infant. And so I should just remind you what happened on April 29th, 1992, a jury acquits 4 LAPD officers of all charges stemming from like the filmed brutal beating of Rodney King. Following that verdict, Los Angeles starts to erupt into nearly a week of unprecedented unrest, violence, burning, killing. There are different ways that you can count the violence done to all of us. Roughly $1 billion in damage by many accounts. Anywhere from 53 to 63 people actually died. There were maybe 3,000 to 4,000 fires that were set, destroying anywhere from 1,000 to, 1,200 buildings. The damage suffered by each community, whether it be Koreans, African Americans, Latinx folks, which we oftentimes do not discuss in our remembering of this event, were enormous. And it's part of what we have to remember, because if we don't remember, there's always a danger that we won't have learned the lessons from that horribly traumatic moment. So why are we doing this? We are having a hard conversation as an act of remembrance to both forge identity and, I guess, community. And part of my style, and thankfully part of the style of all the panelists here, is to embrace pretty hard conversations. That means talking with passion, sometimes audacity, interrupting, disagreeing, but ultimately with respect, respect that comes from a certain kind of respect for each other and the importance of the moment, and maybe some optimism in the possibility that honest conversation can get us past, banal niceties that we repeat to each other every 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, 30 years. When we remember such events. That's certainly my goal as moderator. The rules of engagement will be that we're not going to actually have long speeches. It's going to be actually just a moderated conversation. I'll interrupt people along the way. We'll interrupt each other. And as I said, all that I want is in some sense an honest engagement with extraordinarily challenging causes and consequences. While you're here, I encourage you to type questions along the way in the Q&A. I'll be able to see them and I'll incorporate them into the conversation as appropriate. The way that this conversation will sort of be roughly structured is that there will be an entry question and an exit question for each of the panelists, but in between we'll go in roughly 3 acts. Act 1 will be to focus on the causes, individual and systemic, historical, political, economic, media-driven, the causes of Saigu and what happened on April 29th, 1992. Act 2 will talk about the changes, and the changes for the last, 27, 28 years. I'm going to reserve the most recent past for Act 3. Act 2 is what has actually changed in the physical sites, in terms of political power, in terms of demographics. We want to unpack what changes we've actually witnessed over the past 2.5 decades or so. And then Act 3 is to really kind of dwell a little bit in the hyper reality of the present. We live in extraordinary times. The fact that we're doing this over Zoom and that it's entirely ordinary is a testament to that fact. Global pandemic, Black Lives Matter, insurrection, war in Ukraine, challenges on affirmative action, hate crimes amongst us, different conceptions of racial and social justice. This kind of hyper-speeded reality, certainly over the past 2.5 years, that we want to really try to think about and see in what ways everything that happened back in April 29th gives us insight about what's going on now, or vice versa. So that's how it's going to unfold. And, I'm really fortunate to have people that I respect and who are going to bring to this conversation an extraordinary amount of insight. Okay, enough talking. I will try not to be as verbose. Let's start with the entry question. And the entry question I will ask each of the panelists. And the entry question is simply this. In large part because a lot of people weren't around or can't physically remember. You were around at the time. You were alive, sentient, thinking about things. And there are certain dates, whether it was when JFK was assassinated or on 9/11, there's certain dates that actually you remember, even if you have a bad memory like I do, and it sears a certain kind of moment or feeling, right, in your mind. So I'm going to ask you just, where were you when 4/29 actually happened? And what is the most potent emotional memory that comes to mind when you think about Saigu, April 29? That's the question. I'm going to start off maybe with Saúl. Tell us where you physically were and what your emotional recollection of that event as it unfolded over the next few days. What's the most powerful emotional memory you have?
Sure thing. Thank you, Jerry, and thanks everybody for being here for this important conversation. I was a 4th-year student at UCLA in college, and I would say that for me it's important to share that the building that I was in when I learned about this verdict was a building that housed at that time 6 student news magazines that were described at the time that they were created as special interest newspapers for students of color, ranging from Black students who had fought for the first such magazine, NOMO, to La Gente, where I was working, and Pacific Ties, the API magazine. And for me, that's important because, I was a college student. Part of what we were doing in these spaces was, imagining how we could tear down what we consider to be an unjust world. And, the kinds of stuff that happens in those kinds of moments of youth, our role as young people to question why the world's organized a certain way, included talks about revolution and tearing stuff up. And so you're watching this moment happen. The first emotional reaction was disgust that something that we thought, technology and the recording of this abuse, would perhaps defy the tradition or the experience we've had, which was impunity in the courts for police brutality, which several of our news magazines had been documenting back to when they were created. Particularly in La Gente, the earliest editions were very much focused on police brutality against Chicanos and others in LA. The other thing I remember was after walking home, because we got clear instructions that everyone should go home, was seeing the images of Korean shop owners with armed people with no LAPD protection in sight, and feeling some familiarity about that irony, right? That the police could, that there could be this impunity around something that was recorded, and then communities of color left unprotected by those very systems that produce that kind of harm. The last thing I'll say is that over those days, a tank, I'd never seen a tank in my life, rolled into Westwood, and continue to see these images of Korean people losing their businesses, still no protection in sight, and of course observing the irony of having the shops in Westwood, in the wealthiest part of the city, unharmed, protected, and of course sitting with that tension as well. So all those were things that really impacted me as a young person who was already building myself up to do social justice work across racial groups, and having lived through this moment just would then lift up all the contradictions that it means to do that in a city that is economically polarized, and where that polarization is racially ordered.
So thanks, Saúl. I mean, just the idea of a tank sitting in Westwood while, again, LAPD abandons huge swatches of neighborhoods that are actually burning is a stunning contradiction. I remember hearing that story first time from you, and it still has stuck in my mind. Alexandra, I'm going to ask you next. Where were you, and what's your most intense emotional memory?
I wasn't in LA. I was going to school in New York City. And I remember that day. I remember how the sky looked. By late afternoon, the school and many businesses had shut down in anticipation of unrest, even there in New York City, thousands of miles away from Los Angeles. And it was a surreal moment. I didn't have the visceral connection to Los Angeles that I do now, having become an Angelino back in 20 years ago now. But it brought home to me in a very real way that the story of Taegu is a national story, that the business community's fear of people's righteous anger was palpable even there in New York City, that we Angelinos in California like to say that we are leading the country in terms of trends and just our realities. And I think it's really true that what happens in LA tells a story about this whole country. And that was very, very present to me that day.
Thank you. And for people who don't know the history, people should know that in the in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a lot of tension between Korean merchants and predominantly African American consumers, customers, and you saw examples of grocery stores out in the New York area, New Jersey area, in those areas. Causing and being sites of conflict. So to the extent that we understand this, and we're going to have to unpack this in many ways, as a Black Korean conflict, and I'm going to say that as an if, and if that's the best way to understand it, there were seeds of that conflict that were everywhere, including in the New York area. People should not be shocked that New Yorkers might think, oh, is this the match that has sort of lit a series of upheavals and social unrest throughout our major cities. It happened certainly back in '65. It didn't stop. It wasn't just one city, it was many cities. And so there's a connection in that way. So Jody, where were you? Were you in LA? And what's your most powerful emotional memory?
Yeah, Jerry, I can remember the date, time, and weather. I remember seeing the airwaves saturated a year earlier with the videotape beating of Rodney King. It was the first time in the early 90s when we had round-the-clock news, on cable. Yeah, and so you could turn on the TV anytime, day or night, and see Rodney King being pummeled mercilessly. And, a lot of people said that the riots or uprisings erupted because it was just some hooligans looking for any excuse. You had an excuse anytime you turned on the TV, if you're just looking for an excuse, right? But instead, I was in Pittsburgh starting my teaching career. Black Americans across the country were just stopped and said, now, wait a minute. we all saw that video, and you're telling us that not only are we talking about the police officers, you know, who you can characterize as a couple bad apples, even though there were 20 other officers watching it all go down. You could characterize that one way, but this was a jury, a representative body of the community who sat and looked at this same video that we all saw and said, I don't see anything that crosses the line here, right? And that kind of gaslighting of Black America by not just the police department, but by this representative body, you know, speaking for America, was just jaw-dropping, absolutely stunning and shocking. I remember that day vividly. I remember people waiting for justice, not taking to the streets, waiting for justice, and then taking to the street when the promise of justice seemed so flagrantly flouted by that Simi Valley jury acquittal of those officers for what we all saw with our own eyes.
Powerful. Hey, so like people ought to know that it was actually, again, the trial venue was moved to Simi Valley for a reason, and Simi Valley, as you know, looks a little bit different from the actual downtown courthouse and the veneer jury pool from which it draws. So again, law matters in all kinds of ways. Hey, Jody, were you teaching at the time?
Yes, I started teaching. I was teaching the rule of law, Jerry. I was upholding the rule of law.
So how can I just go there? And I know this is being recorded, so like, but I'm just gonna say, like, how pissed were you, and how could you teach in the moment? Like, you might have had a class that day, the day afterwards. Like, I am curious, just as we are supposed to teach in a formal sense, right? To enjoy the double consciousness of being able to provide doctrine, talk about it in an erudite, disinterested, objective way. On the one hand, but also recognizing that you're a human being, you're a Black man, you've lived what it means to go through some of these things, and you're an expert in criminal law. Like, I'm just trying to unpack how your emotional experience of that moment, this kind of gaslighting of America by jury, which is a lovely phrase, how that allowed you to continue even just performing the act of teaching. Like, break that down for us.
It was very hard, Jerry. You know, it was hard for me to go into that classroom and do my professional duty, which was to tell these students that the rule of law matters, that I'm here teaching you something that really matters, when I know that the rule of law didn't seem to matter to that jury that reached a verdict that was, as you know, against the overwhelming weight of the evidence as to us at that time, as a verdict in favor of Derek Chauvin for the George killing. So it was that kind of professional tension that I felt, Jerry, and demoralization. And I had to find a way to say law matters. And I was able to find a way with my dad and his story about using the law to get himself out of prison. So I knew that the law could be used to liberate, but I wanted to, this really, put a bright light on the fact that sometimes the rule of law isn't really where it's at.
Yeah, wild. Okay, so like I could spend another 20 minutes just on each of these moments and unpacking them, but let's get past the entry question and move on to Act 1. Part of it is the story about just trying to figure out, like, what the hell happened? Like, how is it possible? And we could ask that question at every level of granularity. You could just ask, how could a jury acquit when there was video evidence that was this clear? The same question we could have asked on the Derek Chauvin trial, obviously for the murder of George Floyd, after that long of sitting with his neck, with his knee on someone's neck when George could not breathe. So you could just ask a question about, like, how could a jury misfire so badly? You could actually go up there, as the kids say, there are levels to this game. So it's not just that jury. It could be the larger judicial processes that led to, again, a change in venue. It could be way beyond that. It could be a history that talks about how, again, relationships forged, back in 1965, where you had, again, Jewish communities that actually came in and opened up furniture and clothing stores, and how they left post the 1965 riots and the Watts riots, were replaced by Koreans and another immigrant middle minority group. So we can go history, we can go granular, we can go media, we can go politics. But part of what we want to do is to be able to play the game at every single level. right? Focusing at the most small level of individual agency to the largest continuing aspects of social structure, but to try to add kind of a deeper understanding, like how could this happen? Not just how could there have been an acquittal, but how could there have been this much violence in response to something that is obviously so unjust? That's what I want to try to get some sense of. So Alexandra, I'm going to go back to you and give me your take of what you think it was the real set of causes that produced Haigu.
I'm going to say something just very simple and straightforward, and that is that every minute, every moment that we talk about, analyze the legal mechanisms by which those 4 police officers were acquitted, or we talk about racial conflict or enmity between Asians, Blacks, and Latinos, every minute that we have an analysis of those types of topics that does not place those topics and conflict explicitly within the context of white supremacy and racial capitalism does the ideological work of those systems of inequity, wittingly or unwittingly. We do that work for those systems if we do not explicitly place these occurrences in those contexts. And I really appreciate, Jerry, how complexly you're approaching this topic. And it is I want to make sure though that we don't, because it is so complex, get lost in that, in that complexity and forget that this is about white supremacy. It is about racial capitalism. It is about the disciplining of bodies and communities of color. And we need to have all this conversation within that context.
Super helpful. And again, Alexandra just puts it on the table. So look, if we're not there's an opportunity cost in the time that we spend, and there's a mind share kind of thing. If we focus too small, too individual on legalistic maneuvers, we forget the big picture. Keep your eyes on the prize, and don't be deceived. Got it.
Yeah, and not that we can't talk about those individual experiences, but just yes, the concept.
Absolutely. But I mean, part of that, and part of what this audience needs to sort of understand better is when people use terms like white supremacy, and it's used more often now. Again, things have changed in the past 2 years, frankly, in terms of what has gained mainstream sort of attention and vocabulary, in my view, than what was permitted, 20 years ago. But when you talk about white supremacy or racial capitalism, let's go a little bit into the details. Let's focus on racial capitalism, for example. Like when you say, hey, it's all about racial capitalism, explain to me what that means. In particular, what is the role of, say, I don't know, Korean store owners in racial capitalism?
Well, Koreans came to the United States in the wake of largely there's a first wave that came in the late 1800s, early 1900s,
right. Sugar
to work on the plantations, exactly, in Mexico, Hawaii, and California. But larger numbers came after the 1965 Liberation Act, starting around 68. An act that itself was passed in the context of the struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and was also a response to the civil rights and Black Power movement that was pointing to the racial inequity in the United States and the racism in the United States. So Koreans were coming into a context after being colonized by Japan, recolonized neo-colonial state in South Korea, and having the country divided, coming into this context, having only learned about the Black community and Latino community, what they consumed from Western media, coming into these communities and being shut out from the US labor market and just trying to get by, right? Just trying to get by. And Korean community members were interpolated to play a certain kind of role. I remember back in the 90s, we talked so much about the model minority discourse and how and why it was, being deployed to discipline communities of other communities of color. And that was very much going on. But for the people who were living there day to day, running their stores, trying to survive, trying to build a life in the United States, I think that voice and that experience has been greatly misunderstood, I think, by people on all sides of the political spectrum. But I guess to answer your question, the Korean community played a very particular buffering and mediating role within the discourse of racial capitalism in the United States.
Okay, so this is helpful, and I want to stick around a little bit more, just to see, with both Saúl and Jody, to wonder whether white supremacy, racial capitalism, if there are other terms or concepts you want to put on the board for us to think about causes. So capitalism is just a way that we organize an economy in some sense. I know it's a larger ideology, but it has some sense about property, some sense about contracts. And to say that it's a racial capitalism suggests that, again, depending on your race, you're slotted into certain particular roles, and Asian folks might be slotted into a middleman minority role where you're being squeezed from the real powerful people on top and kind of pissed off customers at the bottom. And it is an unpleasant role to play sometimes. But if you have no other options, and that's the only option you're given when you play this game as you come into this country, right, post 65, then maybe it's the structure of capitalism that actually rigs the game to make it more likely that there will be a certain kinds of conflict. I mean, that's one way to understand this story about racial capitalism. But I want to hear, like Saúl, I want to hear your reactions, right? So we have white supremacy, racial capitalism. Alexandra goes there quickly and says these are really important concepts, right? That actually are the larger counter narratives that should explain things that we can't forget. Do they explain things for you? Do you want to unpack either of these concepts? Do you want to put something else on the board? Do you understand things a little bit differently? Let's complicate things.
I think that I agree absolutely with Dr. Saúl on this. I think that we have to have a capacity to understand structure. When we talk about structure, we could talk about the restructuring of the economy, for example, that had offloaded, all of the plants that were in South LA, the core of the manufacturing industry in LA, Southern California, to places like Tijuana, Ensenada, other places where capital could go and make its profits. And in the place of that, we saw the rise of neighborhoods that were so disinvested that you couldn't have a good paying job coming out of high school like you could in a previous era. And at the same time, you had public policy that chose not to do something about these conditions. So whether you were a recent immigrant from Latin America moving into these neighborhoods that no longer had this job base and that didn't have a safety net, or if you were a longtime Black resident, you were now competing in that order for a much smaller pie and within conditions that were much more brutal. And I think it's important to name that those conditions were a result of public policy. And when we talk about structural racism, we talk not just about the ways in which things like racialized jury selection, jury venue selection. Yosemite Valley wasn't just a white town. It was a town where you had a lot of retired police officers. There's a reason why that white community was chosen. And so for me, it is important to also name what Lisa Ikamoto described after this time, the master narrative of white supremacy, as a master narrative that allows us to filter how we understand each other in those various conditions, in those various situations. If you are part of the sample of people who, were on this jury or the jury in the public court of opinion, we are walking around with a framework about Black criminality, about white supremacy, about the permanent foreignness of Asians or even brown folks who've been here before this was the US. And so our systemic analysis has to include the question of how, for example, people you said on this call who are under 30, looking back at the very same set of facts, asking the same question: where did people live? Under what conditions? What jobs did they have? How did the fact of who they were, what groups they belonged to, mitigate who ate, who got to go to school, who got an education, who didn't? It is also important for them to understand why we might, for example, think about downtown LA today compared to the time that I'm describing, was not being developed into the downtown that they know. The investments in the downtown area were going towards the financial sector. We're not seeing development in South LA. It was going towards the Wilshire corridor all the way to the Pacific. And we know that there's a narrative that drives policymakers at the city level and at the state level, at the county level, to justify the gutting out of a social safety net, right? Putting in a criminal justice dragnet to replace it. And then we look at who becomes vulnerable to this new carceral state as a solution to the lack of these jobs, right? And the lack of jobs. And the last thing I'll say about the question you asked about where Koreans found themselves in that ordering, banks make decisions about which kinds of businesses immigrants can get loans for. And when they can't, they pool their money. They go and they situate themselves, as you mentioned, in ethnic succession in whatever opportunities there are in this context. Those are also structures: banks, financial institutions, public policy at all these levels. And so I would just add that layer, which is what is our filter to understand all the ways in which we are being situated and what happens out of those conditions.
Super interesting. So, like, think about the concepts we've connected already with, and there is a story that our panelists are giving to us. There is a certain kind of economic squeeze that different people actually experience. There is a certain kind of master narrative, potentially, that allows us to read each other in a particular kind of way that might actually spike a certain kind of conflict to maintain a certain kind of economic hierarchy. Jody, I want you to get into the game and talk a little bit more. Right? We have white supremacy with its reflections of a master narrative, using Lisa Ikimoto's phrase. We've talked about racial capitalism when I'm talking about just, again, economic squeeze. We're just trying to hustle, we're trying to make it, but you got limited options as a function of who you are. It's not equally available to all. And that means we play certain kinds of roles with predictable conflicts. If you play that game over and over again, there's gonna be conflict with certain kinds of consequences. Is there anything else that we're missing? Like you're an expert about criminal law, about police violence. And if you want to talk about politics, about media, about police violence, especially, maybe you could lend us your insights a little bit about that.
Yeah, there are three other factors I would throw in right off the top. One was the law itself. Look, what happened as a result of that Simi Valley jury's verdict was the moral credibility and legitimacy of the law itself was completely torpedoed. And we saw the tangible price we pay as a community when the criminal justice system loses its moral credibility and legitimacy in the eyes of a large number of people in the community, right? So, again, I keep coming back to it, Jerry. They waited for justice. They didn't take to the streets when the beating was initially saturating the airwaves. And then the explosion came when that promise seemed so cynically flouted. So number one. Number two, the war on drugs and the fact that 92, we're still at the height of the war on drugs, and it's in the culture. You have groups like NWA saying, F the police, coming straight from the underground, a young brother got it bad because I'm brown, not the other color, so police think they have the authority to kill a minority. They're anticipating Black Lives Matter by 15 years. They're saying this is what's happening in the street. The police are waging this war on drugs, which we never won, by the way, which was a catastrophic failure, and they waged it disproportionately on the back of the Black community, Black and brown community in LA and the communities of color and marginalized communities. And, a lot of people in the Black community went along with that war on drugs, by the way. There were a lot of Democrats, in the 90s as neoliberalism, kind of came in with the Democrats and Clinton took scissors to the safety net, FDR, social, welfare, took the scissors to it, and then increased police presence, more money for police, more money for prisons, in a way saying, we're going to stop spending on crime prevention at the front end. We're going to hire more police, build more prisons, and make jails the receptacles of our social failures at the back end. We kind of threw up our hand. So now you have this reservoir of resentment that's developed between members of the Black community and the police department since the war on drugs, 86, 87, 88, 89, when it was really ramped up. So by the time we get to 92, you have the powder keg sitting there. This spark is all that need to happen. And finally, Jerry, the final factor I throw in is an outrageously corrupt LAPD, a shockingly corrupt LAPD. I mean, so corrupt that even after any of the interventions that were made after 92, when all of this happened, people started saying, well, let's do this, let's do that. When you get to 99, you get Rampart. Rampart, to understand how bad Rampart was, take, three like classic cop corruption movies. Take, Training Day, LA Confidential, and Serpico. You put them all together, you still don't have Rampart. That's how bad it was. The DOJ had to come in, the consent decree, you had an incredibly corrupt LAPD. And that corruption continued, for a long time after that with Bratton's broken windows policing, which again generated resentment between the Black community and police, even though now we have data that shows that misdemeanor arrests and broken windows policing don't help. They don't work. They don't make us safer. So all of that together, I think, was also help to spark those riots or uprisings, Jerry.
So,
Jody, could I ask you a question? How do you, as an expert in the police and police brutality and criminal justice, given the origins of the police in as a kind of protection force for property and moneyed interests at a time when human beings were enslaved, why would we think, or how would we talk about the police as something different? And in saying this, I'm not disingenuously suggesting that every single police officer or every human who wears a badge subscribes to those kinds of ideologies. I'm not suggesting that, but as a system, isn't it doing what it was set up to do? And if not, I would just love to hear your answer to that, because it seems to me that, we're outraged, but why are we surprised when it was set up to do exactly what it is doing as a system? Again, not every single individual, but as a system.
So Jody, are you an abolitionist now?
No. I'm not a complete abolitionist, but I will say this for sure to respond to that. To that very a good question. We cannot. There was a poll done recently, I think 3-4 weeks ago, in which the pollsters asked Black Americans, do you want to defund the police? Majority said no. Okay, and that's what you see in the polls. Poll happened, but majority. But then they asked them a further question. Would you rather be robbed or burglarized or have an unprovoked encounter with a police officer? 56% said they'd rather be robbed. Black folks said they'd rather be robbed than have an unprovoked encounter with police officers, right? That is a fear, a level of fear that's in the Black community that other communities, I think, can't even, many can't even, especially white communities, can't imagine that when they asked white respondents, it was down in the single digits, 2-3%, who would say something like that, right? So you definitely do have this kind of fraught relationship, and you wonder why we had the police chasing Rodney King in the first place. Why do we have police in traffic enforcement? Why do a number of police departments have banned high-speed chases through city streets because somebody had an air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror or a crack in their taillight? You can get the number, 90% of the time you can get that person anyway, right? And you aren't risking all these lives. And more generally, police traffic stops are fraught. When you think of Sandra Bland, Sam DuBose, Philando Castile, Walter Scott, Dante, right. You know, if traffic stops, and the Supreme Court has given police license to practice stop and frisk on wheels with their licensing of pretextual stops that says, even though your unconstitutional hunch isn't enough, if you can find any pretext, then go ahead. You get to go to town, right? And so all of that really, you know, means if you want to do something about this problem, and since Rodney King, this is what we've learned, you can't do the reform route, the body cams and all that. Minnesota, they had all that with George Floyd, community policing, didn't stop anything. You have to reduce the footprint, the number of interactions between police and the community. That is, get them out of traffic enforcement, get them out of homelessness, dealing with that, get them out of dealing with people with mental health issues. And like in the group I belong to, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, unbundle the police, take on, you know, unsaddle them. We saddle them with a lot of responsibilities they don't want. They don't want to be street level social workers. So unbundle is the response, is the answer.
And people choose to misunderstand what folks mean when they say defund the police. It's exactly doing that. It's saying, what is this bizarre overreach and over budget where the police are tasked with doing all sorts of things that they shouldn't be doing in the first place? And, you know, defunding, I mean, that's not even saying abolish.
Yeah, so super interesting conversation about the proper role of policing and how it is policing failed, again, multiple communities in 1992. I'm still thinking about, again, a tank is not really policing, but a tank in Westwood and police officers bailing in the communities where they needed it most. And I gotta emphasize, again, whether we're talking about right-sizing police, again, sort of unbundling the set of services that police are heroically asked to actually serve day in and day out in ways that are too hard for any human being. What I hear so far are a set of structural forces that make it just likely that this is going to be a powder keg. When you have economic, again, disinvestment, when you have a war on drugs, when you have a certain kind of media tail with, again, 24-hour saturation coverage of not only the violence done to Rodney King, but also the murder of Latasha Harlins by a Korean merchant, Sun Ja-do, who was convicted, but ultimately not sentenced to really anything, which was shocking to a lot of people, including Korean folks, that all set the conditions. We were set up to fail in some sense. And so in some ways, it shouldn't be shocking that all the resentment, all the frustration then explodes into a moment of upheaval, which then allows all things actually to sort of come out in different kinds of ways. I want to pivot a little bit to what I called Act 2 and in some ways Act 3. I'm trying to figure out what, if anything, has changed during that time. Because if people buy the story that we were set up to fail, Los Angeles was set up to fail, given racial capitalism, white supremacy, all these other structural factors, what has changed in the past 30 years? Right? People are still trying to make money. We still live in a capitalism. We all make micro decisions day in and day out that maximize our self-interest. When you buy a house in a way that allows your kids to get better education. You buy a house that feels safer. You buy a house that allows you to actually sell it again later on. Those decisions, micro-rational, are embedded in a larger set of structures that might actually exacerbate segregation. What I'm trying to say is that we make individual choices every day that might alter certain things, but it's always in the context of these structural forces. And we've been making those decisions for the past 25 years. Like, have things changed, right? Have all those forces that in some ways set us up to fail gotten worse, gotten better? Have individuals become heroic and decide, you know what, I'm going to resist the structure. I'm no longer going to do that. I'm not going to pursue a self-interest. I'm going to go somewhere else and do something else that is, I don't know, more communal, more altruistic, more fair. What's your sense? Like, dial it forward from 1992 for the next, say, 25, 27 years, not like before the pandemic. Let's do it that way. Before the pandemic, has much change, right? That's what I want to get a sense. Is it equally pessimistic? Is it optimistic? What's your reaction? I'm going to start with Saúl. Like, what's your sense of change over the past 20, 25 years, at least before the pandemic started?
I think it's important to answer this question from the perspective of what has maybe changed for the better and what has not changed or, changed for the worse. And I think, if we are saying we should start with the structural analysis. Anybody who walks out of their door in any part of the city today will see encampments, will see tents, will see people that are living on the streets as an indicator of what the graphics have been telling us every 5 years, every 10 years that we mark this anniversary, which is that inequality is getting worse, and specifically that the top 1% are acquiring more, own more wealth than everybody else at the bottom. And I think that if the point of departure, not just in the analysis of post-92, but post-65, was when you have a level of despair in a community, that folks who live in the neighborhoods that are experiencing these conditions see no other outlet but to express their hopelessness through these kinds of social upheavals, through uprising, through burning things down, then we have to name that that has actually gotten worse. We have a situation where there's all this evidence that this city is now bearing the brunt, its own version of a larger global and a national economic picture that creates the conditions ultimately for the modern day version of public rioting, which in this country, the historian Robin Kelly has told us was actually, for the most part of the history of this country, large events where white people gathered to watch the lynching and with law enforcement participating of Black people. This idea of protesting conditions and, injustice to the police and having a police beating, a police arrest be a proximate cause event that accompanied the evolution of the Black civil rights movement and everything that Black folks have done in our body politic to teach us what it means to collectivize and to speak against the injustices in our government.
So sorry to interrupt you, but if despair has gotten worse, in part because economic inequality has increased, suppose on many metrics that might be so, the rich have gotten richer, the poor have gotten poorer. Again, when we see homeless encampments throughout Los Angeles, we've got reasons to be concerned. So suppose economic despair has gotten worse. Lots of people feel like there are no options for me. There are no jobs, there's no future. What am I supposed to do? I guess the question has to be, will then a, sort of a match put fire to that despair again in a place like Los Angeles or a comparable city? And when that match is somehow thrown intentionally or accidentally or predictably, will the fire actually burn towards one particular group and do disparate amounts of damage to that group? Because people can understand why there's still economic despair. Do you think that's still true that, again, in 92, a disproportionate amount of the anger was targeted at Koreans, right? And the disproportionate amount of damage was experienced by Koreans. I think all the data represent that. Do you think that could happen again, whether it's Koreans or some other group? Or do you think despair exists, but it's now just diffused in a certain kind of way, a certain kind of hopelessness that's everywhere? Or is there a particular sort of, boogeyman or a scapegoat that is going to be targeted? What you're thinking about that?
I don't think that that's necessarily predictable. And, Jody was quoting, NAA of the time. I'll quote Tupac Shakur: in the United States, you live and die by the stereotype. And that is that, people have a view, right? So I don't know when I walk in, right? I don't know if I had been driving through Florence and Normandy as a brown man in at the height of what happened, that I wouldn't have been victim to the kind of despair and street justice that I was describing. When we talk about an ordering that is structural, we're talking about situations where that's what makes this feel almost too complex to understand. But I do think that, I said we should both ask what has gotten worse and what has gotten better. And for me, what has changed and that we can name is in the absence of leadership and recognition about the way that structural racism, racial capitalism has situated us into the situation of 92, we saw the rise of a cross-racial, multiracial social justice community of folks who built institutions in the city where the more specific question of, do we have something at stake in each other's fate, that I think 92 raised, right? Like, I couldn't do much about what I was watching happen to Korean shop owners or families or anybody who was caught up in all of this. I wrote a story as a student. I did some research soon after that, interviewing undocumented Latinos. It was my first time at Carecen in MacArthur Park, a Latino neighborhood that under martial law, the police came in and stole people's money, deported people, hurt people. The kinds of things that happen when the kind of corrupt law enforcement that Jody just mentioned exists, and then you suspend all expectation of rule of law. And I don't know that we could predict that for a brown immigrant at that time or an Asian immigrant at that time, they could know where they would be when the fire gets lit. But I do think that this meaning making, this community building, and this commitment to a broader idea of social justice that asks ourselves really hard questions. And I just would push back on how you framed it, which is, an individual making a decision about going to do something more communal. The question is not individual, it's structural. The question is about what it is that we do in the face of being subjects in structural questions that are embedded in these kinds of things. I'd like to just name one. Since then, we also live in a state where we have built unionized jobs around one of the largest carceral states. And we have a problem as we're talking about defunding the police, naming what that challenge brings to those of us who are in the blue state, see ourselves as the resistance, which is, can we confront our union members to understand that it's not just a bad policing, it's the funding that we have for probation officers, for social workers that are working in a model of a carceral mindset, and in sometimes even public defenders, right, that are invested in their own ideas, right, of that larger master narrative of what people should be paying a price for and not. And I think those are harder questions for us in this context around what it means after 92 to be doing this work. Because I do want to say I'm an abolitionist. I do want to say that I think we need to defund all of these systems, because the fundamental definition is, can we take our public money away from death-dealing systems and move them into life-affirming systems? That definition I embrace, and I think all of us are in situations where we are going to see that contradiction, whether we're in an elite law school that has gotten so expensive that when I came to it, the professional school fee that's now $50,000 did not exist. What do we think that puts young lawyers who want to go and do criminal defense work to do?
Right. So, and I get it, but there are some comments, right? Some questions that have been sort of typed in by some people. And again, I'm going to press you. In some sense, it sounds incredibly, powerful and idealistic, right? But people will say, you have a romantic vision of a time where we could just right-size everything, where we can defund all the bad stuff and fund all the good stuff. But the truth is, life is complicated, and we have to recognize that some things, right, at the moment of, again, April 29th, when all the outrage and resentment boiled over, it targeted Koreans in a particular kind of way. And there are Korean people who are still trying to figure out, why us? What did we do to deserve that? Now, again, sometimes that's naive, and sometimes, again, it resists responsibility for the freaking racism that exists within all communities, including Korean communities. Whether you blame that on watching a lot of American, media back in Korea before you came over, I'm not sure how much of a pass I'm going to give you for that as the explanation. We got to own the racism in each of us, and you should know that, again, East Asians generally. I'm an implicit bias scholar, and so if you just look at which groups have the most implicit bias in favor of whites over blacks, number one is white people. Number two is East Asian people. So we're right behind in this hierarchy of implicit bias, put aside explicit bias. But you should also know that if you look at the relationship of seeing this face and seeing foreignness and not American, the number one group is American. That implicit is, excuse me, the number one group amongst Americans is white people. Number two are Black people. So Black people see this face as foreign as much as white people do. All of this is just to say there's individual agency, and there's also a lot of reasons why, again, Koreans were the target back then. And then I'm trying to figure out what's going to happen going forward. And so I want to be partly responsive to, I think, some of the comments and questions that are being asked, which is totally get the structure part. I'm not going to be like stupid individualistic and say it's everything about choice. We were set up to fail. It was not a random distribution of violence that happened, right? And so then the question is, what produced that? And then what does that mean going forward? And now I want to pivot a little bit to Act 3 and really emphasize everything that's happened post-pandemic, I guess, just Black Lives Matter, right? I mean, obviously this question has been something that we've been asking for forever, but like things have changed post-2020. If you think about the massive, again, public protests that were, again, pan-racial on these questions, has everything that's happened like post-2020, has it made it such that there's enough, I don't know, goodwill across different kinds of communities, such that when the match is lit the next time, that we'll do better in some sense, that there won't be this kind of targeting, or if such targeting starts towards any community, we can all get together, whether it be on a stage or on a Zoom. Like I'm calling all of you definitely, so that we can actually talk in a different kind of way than what happened back in 1992. I want to try to figure out how you feel about
Jerry,
that.
let me ask you a question about that. How you know, in 1965, there was no waiting for a court. The 65 rebellion happened after the police came and did what they did in that community as the match was lit. 92, as Jody said, people waited for justice, and then there was this thing. Yeah. Why is the post-George Floyd moment with a massive, the biggest cross-racial, cross-generational, peaceful rise of protest in this country against systemic racism, not a response to your question? I mean, to me, it seems like that is what we saw happen back then. And I think the harder question is what has happened since, right? In terms of responses from liberals and conservatives in power.
Right.
So
or what hasn't happened.
Yeah, if that is the response, I mean, like, but that is potentially a very positive, well, it could be seen as an optimistic take, but I want to hear again from, I guess, all of you, like, if you see, again, both the jury verdict and all the stuff that happened that actually prompted even just the prosecution, much less the jury verdict, as evidence that we now can talk about these things, like systemic racism, that we could actually work together, right, in a particular kind of way that was not possible in 1992. If that's the panelist take, I think that would be kind of optimistic. I guess a part of me is actually more skeptical, right? Think about think about lots of hate crimes that exist against the Asian people, and what we see on constant video loops in certain kinds of social media campaigns, where you see, again, older Asian people being, again, attacked. It's not lost on me that people use these examples, especially if it's done by Black and brown men, as ways to exacerbate tensions between communities. And people feel like no one's talking about our fate again. And if, again, national politics with either international politics with North Korea or China go south or sideways, if, again, a virus comes in a second time with a different kind of transmission that actually does even more violence to our health, who gets blamed, right? And whether or not there will be another set of reasons why, of course, we're set up to fail. And of course, the violence will head in this direction. And have we really learned anything? Those are the things that I feel uncertain about, even though I feel somewhat optimistic. I want to be mindful of time because we're at 6:36, and in some ways this sounds awful, but I want to actually have people, in some ways, my job has to be to ask each of you, in some ways, to think about in some ways, getting to an exit question, think about a recommendation or a piece of advice that you want to give to the listeners, many of them who are attorneys, right? They've heard this really interesting set of analyses. They've heard about what's changed in some ways, and how it is that maybe things have gotten better, maybe things have not. What is, in some ways, your best piece of advice? One ask for the lawyers and the other folks in the audience. And, you know, if each person could take like 2 minutes to think about what you would ask all of us to do individually or as members of institutions, what would that advice be? So Jody, I'm going to hit you up first, right? And I know that there's a lot of other things that we were talking about if you need to make a comment on that, but I really want to hear, like, what's your wisdom, right? And you're a wise soul. You were wise back in the 90s. You look wise now. So, like, tell us what you think we ought to be doing.
Oh, you put pressure on me now. Now I got something to live up to. I'm going to try, Jerry.
Don't say like do your cardio or something. Like, don't do that. Yeah.
Fight for justice. Fight for justice. That's what we saw, Jerry, in the streets 2 summers ago in LA, 6 weeks in a row, every night, every day, right? It was Latinx, Asian, Black, white, everybody was coming together about a fundamental social injustice that we all wanted to acknowledge, recognize, cope with, deal with directly, right? And that's where solidarity comes from, you know, when we can stand in justice together. You know, the whole saying, you know, it's a tired old saw, but no justice, no peace. You know, that's really what we're talking about. The Black community at the time in '92, felt especially aggrieved towards the Korean community. We know by looking at that video of Latasha Harlins getting her brains blown out while she has $2 clutched in her hand, right? And that riveted each other, that blade, you know, and the justice system seemed to say Black lives don't matter that much. Look how much Black lives matter, no consequence. You know, and before that, you have the Bernard Goetz case. He shot 4 guys running away from him. You know, I teach it in my criminal law class. They were running away. The jury acquitted them. You know, and now here we are in '92, the jury's acquitting these officers. So, you know, the idea of no justice, no peace, if we can all fight for justice, stand for justice, then I think that's what builds community, you know, among one another, with one another. There has been, I'll just say this real quick, enormous change. And I have a lot to feel hopeful for since '92. We are now talking more seriously than we ever have about unbundling the police. We've gotten rid of the reforms that don't work. You know, all of the kind of body cams, you know, implicit bias training, community police, all that, what Minneapolis, that doesn't work, we realize. And so now more and more we're zeroing in on the fact that we're dealing with a punishment bureaucracy, a bloated punishment bureaucracy. And in that bureaucracy, it's grown in LA under Garcetti, it grew by $1 billion. We're spending $8.2 million a day on police, right? And the recognition that more and more of us are seeing that in LA, they voted in Gascon and out Jackie Lacey, a traditional law and order politician, after those marches in the street. And they voted in Measure J, which was a defund the police measure, 10% of the LA County budget to non-incarceration alternatives. That's the voters at the ballot box, right? And they legalized marijuana since '92. They've, you know, made cuts in the war on drugs. So there's a lot to be hopeful for, but there's also a big struggle ahead.
Excellent. Alexandra.
Yes. So I was going to say earlier, but we just we really went really quickly through the Act 2, the kind of 20 years out, that, you know, in this conversation, and I'm partly responsible, we've been going back and forth between the structural and the individual. But there's a really important middle ground between the individual and the structure, and that is the collective organizations, the collective movements, the collective institutions, and the informal actions that we take as workers, as immigrants, as people of color, and so on. I remember analyzing the census data from 2020 and 2010. This was back in 2011, and noting that in Koreatown, while the percentage of immigrants was about the same in 2000 and 2010, the number who had been there for more than 10 years went from a tiny minority to the overwhelming majority. That's just one community and one type of change. But a lot of things did happen. All these organizations, community organizations sprung up, including Kiwa, but also many others, COCO, many organizations sprung up. We actually forged the experience of working together, not just as individuals, but as people in organizations and in movements. And that's what we're doing today. And I think that, yes, I would reiterate Saúl's comments about all of those indicators of inequity and injustice have gotten worse, right? It's people's incomes have actually gone down. People's wealth has gone down from before, but we also have more tools now than we did, and we have more experience with each other than we did. And it is possible to work together. We just have to actually do that. And the examples that Jody gave of Measure J and other things, Kiwa, my organization, we are organizing workers to fight together for justice across racial lines. And we are also excited that we're going to qualify the United to House LA ballot initiative on November's ballot, which will charge a mansion tax only to property owners who have properties over $5 million, tax those property sales to fund solutions to homelessness and the housing crisis. That's an example, and that's not an individual answer, it's a collective answer, and it's a justice answer that points the way for, it's just one example of the kinds of things we can do, but we have to do them together.
Thank you. Saúl, we only have about a minute. Your thoughts?
I would just say to lawyers, whatever your time out of law school is, for you to know, anybody who's been legally trained, somewhere in this city there are groups of people either organized formally as a nonprofit, as an association, or informally who need your skills. If you feel more deflated thinking about the particular role that you have and whether or not it's capable to, in your day-to-day work, do something that's out of your hands, right? Because we've been talking a lot about structure. One thing you can do concretely is go to where there are good people trying to do good things with your skill sets. That's what's fundamentally underlying the love and the commitment that we have to each other to not just come together every 5-10 years after Saigu and rehearse a kind of solidarity, but really feeling it for each other. And I think just the fact that you've organized and attended this panel is a real model of how to begin doing that.
Extraordinary advice and recommendations from our extraordinary panelists, Jody, Alexandra, Saúl. I'm really grateful for the conversation. I know that I certainly could have enjoyed this conversation for 2 more hours, but our time is up.
But not 3.
I think APABA folks will come now back online to close us out.
Yes, thank you, Professor Kang. Really appreciate all of the panelists for leading us through that incredible history, and all of the mix of personal and theoretical was just fantastic. For all our attendees, thank you again for participating in this important conversation. LA Uprising 1992 until now, each other together forward. Live attendees to this evening's panel discussion will receive an email with a CLE certificate. So the email that you used to register for this event, you will receive an email with a CLE certificate. We would also appreciate your feedback on tonight's panel. The evaluation form is available on the MCLE committee's webpage for the apaba.org website. Also, you can use the link that was provided by Kathy earlier tonight. On behalf of APABA and all of our co-sponsors, I want to again extend my sincere and appreciation to the esteemed panelists that we had tonight, and then the MCLE committee that helped put together this fantastic event. Thank you again, and good night.